if your child who has an individualized education program has been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, one thing that you need to think about is, are there drugs or alcohol involved? And sadly, this is the case in many adolescents in particular who are psychiatrically hospitalized. What I will say is this, and it's tricky, but let's back up a little bit. Very often when a child comes into a hospital situation, in fact, I think always, there is some toxicology that happens because obviously the medical team want to know what's happening with the student. Sometimes it's obvious it was an overdose or something quite clear like that, or the child came home completely obviously.
Well, they have to rule it out as well.
Yes, they have to rule it out or make it clear. And sadly, some families are not aware of how profound the problem is. Maybe a parent thinks that this is typical teenage experimentation, and then the report comes back with drugs that their parents were unaware of that the student was using, or that in the therapeutic process the student is revealing to the team that in fact it's a bigger problem than that. And so when the diagnoses come across, it will often include, if there is a drug or alcohol problem, it will include usually that diagnosis, so that there may be alcohol abuse is listed as a diagnosis. And so how is that going to impact the determination of the IEP team? Well, unfortunately, this can become a real problem in these kinds of negotiations, because school districts will often say, see, this is clearly a drug problem. Now, if your child already has an IEP, there's already been a determination by the team that there is a disability and that disability requires special education services. So that argument that this is not a disability is sort of already, that ship has sailed, so to speak. But now, as you're considering whether the child requires support for an emotional issue, if it becomes a drug problem argument, then it gets tricky. And so what I would advise parents to look for, and what I typically ask psychiatric hospitals to tell me about is there evidence that this student may be self-medicating? Is there evidence that this is a student who has a diagnosed disability in the psychiatric realm that isn't being addressed, and that the student is self-medicating, is finding ways to address the way they feel through drugs and alcohol? The other thing that's important to know is that there are many studies out there that talk about the fact that kids who have disabilities, all types of disabilities, are significantly more vulnerable and more likely to be prone to drug and alcohol use and abuse than other kids, which unfortunately we already know in society all kids are vulnerable to that. So you have a double whammy here. And so when I go into an IEP team and I'm feeling that the resistance I'm getting from the team is that they suspect this is really a drug problem as opposed to an educational problem, then I point out, look, we know that kids with disabilities are vulnerable. We know that this child has a disability and is therefore more vulnerable to it. We don't just ignore it. It may mean that this is part of the overall program that we put together.
So what do parents need to know about the distinction when the distinction is made that there have been drug or alcohol involved as they've been to the hospital and that's been revealed?
What I think you need to know if your child is already eligible for services, already has an IEP, is that it doesn't let the school district off the hook of offering an appropriate program. Just because a child is using or even abusing drugs and alcohol doesn't mean everything's okay. In fact, sometimes it's the reverse. Sometimes the child is using and abusing drugs and alcohol because they feel so frustrated with their own environment or their educational environment.
So don't let the fact that there's been drug or alcohol get you off the path that it is still a special education issue.
And don't do the very common instinctual thing that many parents do, which is try to cover it up. Don't try to pretend to your school district it doesn't exist. Don't ask the hospital to white out the diagnosis of the alcohol abuse. I'm a firm believer that the truth will out, and if it comes out in a way other than you giving that information in a proactive way, you're going to look like you're hiding something. And it's very natural to say, I don't want them to know about it. And of course, if there are criminal issues, I mean, these things get very tricky. But I really think it's a bad move when you're approaching your school district about programming for your child for you to pretend something's not happening when it is.
It's a tough subject all around the board.
It is.